Good evening. My name is Bob Liff, and this is the CUNY Forum, a monthly town meeting bringing prominent New Yorkers together with students and faculty of the Edward T. Rogowski Internship Program in Government and Public Affairs. When Elliot Spitzer said everything would change on his first day in Albany, he probably didn't plan for the mudfest his staffers set off with their aggressive pursuit of Republican State Senate Leader Joe Bruno. What began as an investigation into Spitzer's staffers' attempts to probe Bruno's use of the state helicopter for political travel has morphed into a congressional-style, partisan-tinged series of investigations involving the Attorney General, the legislature itself, the Albany District Attorney, the state police, a newly constituted State Investigations Commission, and the press, which has found itself in the uncomfortable position of being a player in the shenanigans. Some observers believe Spitzer has achieved something very difficult, giving Bruno, who is steeped in the backroom deal-making culture of Albany, the high ground. Democrats seem somewhat grateful that Bruno, using the Senate's rarely used investigative powers to divert Spitzer from a more substantive agenda, has given that high ground right back. Setting aside the sheer entertainment value, there are larger civic costs being paid. A recent Newsday article laid out a series of issues that are being held hostage by an Albany gridlock that was commonplace during the 12 years of George Pataki, but which Spitzer vowed to change. Property tax relief for senior citizens, capital construction funds, pay raise for judges, scores of appointments, and perhaps most importantly, campaign finance reform, an issue that Bruno perceives as threatening the Republicans' tenuous hold on their last bastion of power in Democratic-dominated Albany, remain unresolved. The gridlock raises additional questions about how investigations can be conducted in a hyper-partisan atmosphere in which the investigations themselves appear to be a tactic to avoid issues one of the partners, in this case the Senate, does not want to take up. Ronald Reagan always described an optimist as a kid who saw a room full of manure and knew there had to be a pony in there somewhere. So we are joined by four prominent New Yorkers to talk about what's going on in Albany and to look for lessons in the muck. Ken Sherrill is a professor of political science at Hunter College. John Flatteau is a professor of public administration at Medgar Evers College. Susan Del Percio is a veteran Republican political consultant with O'Reilly Strategic Communications. And Elizabeth Benjamin is a political reporter for the New York Daily News and the editor and writer of the Daily News political blog. Let me start with you, Ken. We're used to seeing this in Congress and the investigations of Clinton, and now with the Democrats in control of Congress, the investigations of the president. We're not used to seeing this in Albany, are we?
We're not used to seeing a functioning government in Albany. No, we're not used to seeing legislative oversight. We're not used to seeing checks and balances in any meaningful sense. But one would expect that, you know, in the American governmental system, in almost any functioning state legislature, the legislature would engage in oversight and would engage in investigations.
John, what's the cost of this? I mean, CUNY has in particular suffered costs. I mean, I mentioned some of the issues. What's the cost of this gridlock?
Well, first, I would agree with Ken that what we're seeing at play are checks and balances at work with the legislature and the executive branch going at it. And I think that's actually shows our democracy in action. Meanwhile, while they're jousting with one another, though there are a lot of issues that have been pushed to the back burner. Some are critical, like the infrastructure issue. After a bridge fell into the river in Minneapolis, now everyone is beginning to pay attention to infrastructure issues in New York. And until the governor and both houses can come together to come up with either some type of intergovernmental committee or a commission, I think the legislature, Gianaris and Golden, you have a bipartisan bill already out there to set that up. You have other issues like tax relief, tuition assistance. Actually, Senator Bruno laid out an agenda for a session he wants to call on, I guess, on October 22nd. To suggest that government is no longer in gridlock, and they are trying to get past Troopergate and spying on the Senate leader and, you know, who done it to whom.
Susan, for 12 years before this year, Shelly Silver was the stubborn guy blocking all progress. Now Shelly seems to be the Cheshire Cat, sitting there quietly letting Bruno take the heat. I mean, impeachment.
He's basically sitting back to see where he wants to play his cards right now. He has no reason to jump into this argument because it gives him no advantage. When the governor needs him, he can play his cards there privately to the governor and do a little trading there. And also don't forget that the speaker and the majority leader have always had a relationship that at times comes together to go against a governor, whether it be a Republican or a well, I should say the past Republican governor. So they're also very used to working together. So Shelly's able to play a lot of cards, has a very good hand dealt to him, I should say.
I've always thought he would be one of the best poker players. I really say I don't know if he plays poker. Liz, you covered Albany for a long time and still write about it. What's going on here? I mean, how strange is this?
Well, I mean, there are a couple of points. First of all, the hand that Shelly Silver got dealt, he dealt himself. I mean, he, out of all of these guys, has played this incredibly well, which is really ironic because when the governor was elected, everyone thought that Shelly Silver would be the first to go. Everyone thought that Shelly Silver, for the past 12 years, has been the top Democrat in the state, and he got used to being the top banana. And so now you have a new Democrat coming in who's going to be the top banana, and we all thought, everyone was thinking that maybe Shelly Silver would get ousted. Instead, he comes out smelling like a rose. He wins on congestion pricing, arguably. He won last year on this, or a couple years ago now, on the stadium. So he's played all of these cards so well. It's really...
He even beat Governor Spitzer.
Yes, on the controllers, on the controllers race. So it's, or selection of a new controller for Alan Hevesey's seat. But it's very, that is unusual in and of itself. I would argue this argument about inaction and how it's positive that there are checks and balances in Albany would be great if, in fact, they were arguing about something that was substantive. If they were arguing about legislation, Medicaid reform, or Med-Mal reform, or even campaign finance reform, or anything that was actually substantive, construction for SUNY and CUNY, that would be one thing in terms of checks and balances. Instead, or budgeting, what you have is a political warfare, and that's why everything else is held hostage at this point.
Well, but I don't think, I was just going to say, I don't think that anything's really being held hostage in its traditional format, because let's face it, after the budget's passed, the legislators go home for the day, and usually, well, it's gone on until July and August, but they went home in June.
Right.
They were done. So that's when we normally get we have a month normally to get more issues covered because the budget's holding everything hostage. Session's done. People are out. The fact is that you have the Speaker's office, the Majority Leader's office, and the Governor's office talking privately about some things, but you wouldn't have Senate or the Assembly in session at all.
But one of the subtexts here is after they go home, they go into war. Because the Democratic minority in the Senate is within 3 seats of retaking that House. And that's part of the political dance that's going on here.
Well, that's a
and
debate.
the governor has been somewhat neutralized politically because of his problems now.
Self-inflicted wounds.
Yes, but that's why this dance is going on.
And when you say
right
self-inflicted,
now.
I mean, there's an important point. You said everything. Elliot Spitzer promised everything will change on day one. It did. It got a lot worse because he really was not being a governor. He was trying to run the show like he ran his AG's office, which is fine if you have to rely on only yourself and your staff that you choose. But when you have to work with 2 other people and you are an equal partner to get things done, you have to change the way you do business.
Reverting to the argument she made in the gubernatorial election when she ran the Republican challenger.
I really think there are 2 points. One is that the Democrats retain the opportunity to use this scandal to campaign against the Republicans. That it puts on the table, you know, what has Joe Bruno been doing? What is the Republican majority like? How venal and corrupt are they? What substantive public policy areas have they not gone into over the past dozen years? So on and so forth. I'm not saying that they will do this or that it's true. I'm simply saying that it opens the door to doing this so that down the road this could lead to a change in power in the legislature fairly quickly. Well, second, I think that that what you're seeing here, you know, right now we're going through, or we anticipate going through a kind of show trial. But what we don't know is whether the individual members of the Senate are going to be commanded by a puppeteer who is going to script everything that they do or whether members of the legislature will actually be allowed to think and speak for themselves. Now that's very dangerous because they've never done that.
Right, exactly.
See, the difference, though, a couple of points. The difference between the Washington investigations, I mean, the Democratic investigations, I would argue, were about policy. The Republican investigations in the Clinton years dealt more with personal peccadillos.
Well, Watergate was about...
But Watergate's going back to the 1970s. But what I don't remember seeing is a Senate launching this kind of an investigation on something that so directly affects them, involving their own leader. I mean, obviously partisanship always taints neutrality and some sense of kind of moving ahead in a fair manner. Partisanship always does that, but that's the system we have. Here you have it totally skewed because they feel that Spitzer went out to get Joe Bruno, to use the state police to get Joe Bruno. Whether a crime was committed or a crime was not committed, the district attorney says no, the attorney general says no. Clearly there was kind of a use of state resources to go after Bruno. That may be a terrible thing, but to think that Bruno could lead the investigation into this when you have a state investigations commission, a new state investigations commissioner, where if you want to attack him, you got to attack John Feerick, who I think is about as much
Public Integrity Commission.
Right. I mean,
the one that Spitzer appointed most of the members of the board.
Spitzer appointed most of the members, but that's always the
Well, the majority leader appointed all the members of the two Senate committees that are now conducting the hearing, governmental ops and investigations.
You bring up a very good point, because that is this. Everyone knows that it's the Senate majority and who's leading that charge. Absolutely. It's clear as day, and you could definitely say it's political, even though they do use these hearings as a guise of coming up with legislation, whether it be on new use of travel. Right, and they have to, and they do that. So that idea that you bring up is 100% correct. But what happened with when they started moving this panel into one, when they start the Public Integrity Unit, which was passed back in January, you could really see the governor's kind of mojo there, if you will, because that's when the Senate was shaking in their boots, and they agreed to this. And in essence, they agreed to let the executive chamber monitor itself. When asked at a press conference, Eliot Spitzer, why do you want to take charge of this unit now? And he said, because I want it. I don't, not for any real reason other than I want control over it. Maybe he was fortuitous. Maybe he saw some trouble down the pike, and that's where he is today. And I'm kind of, I say that in jest. But the matter is that is in fact, and some can argue, a governor's appointed panel. Now, as of a week ago, you couldn't actually say the same thing, but under this panel, you have that. You have Andrew Cuomo's report, and you have the DA's report.
Two independently elected
Democrats.
Executives running independent investigations of the same mess.
But originally, if you recall, the Senate said, we're not going to start our hearings. Why don't you give Andrew Cuomo the power to subpoena? And that was the first thing they had to. Now,
everybody
don't get me
knows
wrong,
that Andrew Cuomo wants to be governor. I mean, there's so many different areas.
That he would not be overly partisan.
But you can't say that there's one defining report that's going to one investigation that stands on its own, when in fact the Senate is one of 3 that are going to come down, which are seen as Democratic controlled. So you kind of have to look at the whole picture. Yes, it's political, but there's a lot of different politics going on.
But there are shades to this. When you ask whether or not we'd seen this in the past, I covered Albany for almost 10 years, right? And now I'm sort of splitting my time between there and New York. No, we've not seen it to the degree of animosity that we're seeing now, right? It's never been this bad. And you talk to people who had been there for quite some time before I got there, and they, there was more collegiality. Yes, they fought, and there were dust-ups, but it was never the kind of standoff. But then again, you never had a situation where you thought that the whole state, Spitzer made it very clear, he wanted the Democrats to take the Senate. He came in, he took a guy out, Mike Balboni, who was a Republican senator in Nassau County in a Democratic district. He took him out and said, hey, why don't you come be my Homeland Security czar? You can fly around in helicopters, it's going to be great. Come on in. He did.
I don't know about the helicopter thing.
Well, he does. But it's a good job, right? And he does have. He was the head of the Homeland Security Committee and the Veterans Committee, so he had some expertise. Was he the best man for the job? It is argued that perhaps maybe it was more about politics. It was part of their strategy
to take.
And then they took that seat. and they took it out of the hands of the Republicans because it is in a Democratic district, and you closed the gap even further after the governor had played very hard during the election, which it was clear, I'm sorry, that he was going to win, and which he won by a lot. He had a lot of money, and then he went around into Senate districts and cut ads for Senate Democrats. This is even before he won. And Joe Bruno sent a signal and said, hey, whoa, what are you doing? You haven't even gotten here yet, and you're trying to take out my guys. And Elliot Spitzer continued to do that. Then he had the special election, and he took that seat. He made it eminently clear he wanted to take over the Senate.
But isn't it precisely Elliot Spitzer's rationale for running, take us back to that election, is I'm going to change that political culture, and the go-along stuff where I don't mess with your guys if you don't mess with my guys. He precisely went after that.
That culture is unique to New York. That we're all just going to carve up the pie. We'll all share in power. You have the Assembly, we'll have the Senate, the government will do nothing, and we'll all profit.
But we've seen the danger of single-party government in D.C. Look at what happened in Washington, absolute power corrupting absolutely. Now Elliot Spitzer comes in, and he argued he wanted to change everything. It's true. But then when people saw what that meant that Elliot Spitzer would have complete control and that his whole reform agenda would all come through.
Well, I'm talking about, you may not like single-party government. That's different from not having free and open elections.
Well, then you have to do redistricting.
That's right. That's right.
Well, but let's
and you're not going to do redistricting.
That's one of those issues on the back burner right now due to the gridlock that nobody's paying attention to.
Isn't redistricting and campaign finance reform, doing independent redistricting, are two issues that Joe Bruno, who is a very smart
and that means you've got to have his dead body.
I mean, that's what it comes down to. For it either.
No, or Congress.
Well, but the Speaker has a 65-seat majority. The Speaker's control of that chamber is not.
But the more seats he has, the more insulation he has against a coup.
That's right.
He holds his power because nobody can put together a coalition
against him. But obviously, the
stakes
stakes are a lot higher for Joe Bruno. So, I mean, and both campaign finance reform and
the redistricting
and an independent redistricting directly threaten he's very smart and he's right. It directly threatens their continued control. Prior to this story breaking, to Spitzergate breaking, when the governor first started going around talking about campaign finance reform, Joe Bruno vowed to vote on the death penalty every 20 minutes. Every time they came in, they were going to vote on the death penalty, even though he knew it would never get through the Assembly. I work for New Yorkers against the death penalty if I ever, put my bias on the line here. But Bruno this has been a godsend for Bruno in diverting attention from things that he doesn't want to see.
But Bob, don't you remember that you had Bruno come out very aggressively on the campaign finance issue? And he made a few points back then, and he certainly was, I wouldn't say riding high, but he was going toe-to-toe before this report came out. Now, this was just kind of the icing on the cake, if you will, but he was setting up the whole,
during the budget,
the rich man's son versus the working class fellow. Whether you agree with it or not, he certainly was making some inroads for
But I also remember him saying, Governor, don't go around the state talking about, and again, because I work on New Yorkers Against the Death Penalty, don't go around talking about campaign finance reform. Come back and pass the death penalty.
He also makes a good
and property taxes.
He also helped pass a new ethics law this year.
But Bruno made a good point, which is to say that people don't wake up in the morning and say, man, if only they would pass campaign finance reform in Albany. It's true that people need to be educated, is the governor's response. People don't understand how much their political system is beholden to the fact that it's go along, get along, incumbency protection program. We need to break the back of campaign finance in order to have real representative government. The thing is, people don't really get that. What they care about is taxes, what they care about is jobs, what they care about maybe is the death penalty, things that are easier to understand. It's hard to go up to a person and be like, campaign finance reform is going to save your life.
You only galvanize support for political reform when there's a scandal. So
but
now
this one ain't going to help them.
So now you've got the scandal, and the question is who's going to take advantage of it.
Everybody is
compromised. But the fact is that no one saw this coming. I mean, Elliot Spitzer said, not just elect me because the writing was on the wall. He was going to
choir boy.
He said, elect me by a gazillion. Let me show I can reign the world. Because I'm coming in on a white horse. I will solve all of your problems. I'll not only solve campaign finance reform, I'll fix your property taxes. I'll do everything that you want because I can do it. Now he's come in. He got some ethics reform done.
And he got workers' comp
He's got
reform done. He did
workers'
some
comp.
things that
And
were...
and then it stopped, and then it went screech. His budget negotiations, as someone said, every time he goes into a closed door, he loses room meeting.
Yeah.
He loses because he didn't really want to negotiate in the open, and which kind of led down the trail of how we got to this.
It's
why
the hypocrisy
this
that's the
Spitzer
problem.
gate
Yeah.
became such a big deal, because even as those negotiations were going on, Senator Bruno was saying, "Hey, I don't want to be in a room with this guy without other people. I can't. Every time I walk out of the room, I hear something else I said." And he just, that relationship of trust didn't exist. And that is, after Spitzergate and all of this stuff and all the nonsense that's going to happen this summer, that's going to be the biggest problem for New Yorkers. You're going to have legislative leaders that can't work together and can't trust each other to come together on deals.
Right.
And that's what's going to really gridlock everything. Governor Spitzer said that he was going to use the summer and this fall to work on his budget so everyone could get on board early, so that way services could be delivered. Schools, SUNY, CUNY would know where their budgets are. We know where capital budget projects were going to stand. But none of that is going to happen because none of them can trust each other. So that is going to be the biggest challenge.
One of the crazy things about New York politics is that you probably have to go back to Hugh Carey to think of a governor with whom members of the legislature had the feeling that this is somebody you could do business with. That you could. Well, you think there was somebody
Kerry,
else?
Cuomo.
Well,
Not for long.
And even Pataki, they got the death penalty.
Yes.
Because every governor has a money
but very brief.
Not this brief.
Not
24 days.
I mean,
One term.
I'm not even sure it lasted long enough to be a honeymoon. This is a one-night stand.
Yeah, I think,
But I think a lot of it goes
this
to
is a no.
the personal and
beating a
managerial
metaphor to
style of the leadership. That's what you're referring to. That's a part of the equation, the dynamic too. Yeah.
I mean, because he comes in as a prosecutor.
he came in as a white knight. Like Susan said, he came
Much
in.
as Rudy did.
Kerry
In the
had
city.
very powerful
But no, I'll tell you what
senior
is-
staff
Much as
in
Rudy did
his
in terms of being
office.
a
is that Rudy at least had come through a kind of government service, whereas Spitzer really parachuted in. I mean, yeah, he'd been an assistant DA.
He ran twice and lost.
He-
He
well,
ran in
well, he
'94.
lost,
and
He
yeah.
ran twice and lost.
He lost
but he
once,
didn't
yeah.
He lost
have.
once. He
He
ran-
didn't
almost
have
lost
a
in
He
career.
wasn't
But
a
also-
deputy
but also
U.S.
when-
Attorney
when-
General before he became the state's
He
chief
wasn't
old
legal
enough.
officer.
Yeah,
That's his point.
Yeah.
He catapulted
But
to
Rudy
the top,
came
so
in-
he's used
Yeah.
to that strategy.
Rudy came in, and so did Governor Pataki, for that matter, at a time where New York was deemed, whether you believe it or not, it was certainly perceived as in crisis. Republicans in the state and New York City tend to get elected and only get elected if something's horribly, horribly, horribly wrong.
Usually
and needs
it's the
to be
I was
Democrats.
going to say typically the Democratic candidate.
Well, one could see, that argument can be made. But now,
I don't like that
Governor
comment.
Spitzer came in under a different circumstance, and he came in more of, sunny days and. What was the song that he played on his
Happy days are here
commercials?
again? I don't know. Right.
This
They-
little
the-
light of
this
mine.
little light of
Oh,
mine, and he was
please.
going to make it shine, and everything was going to be great.
It's true.
And he really didn't. He's not able to have that entrance. When Rudy came in, it was let's fix things. We're going to take control.
but I
of
would
crime.
argue with
when
you
Governor
that-
Pataki came in, it was death penalty. That was the
Yeah,
first.
but I
thing.
would argue with you that
Well, it's
Rudy
also anything
didn't.
but
That Rudy
Cuomo.
didn't win. People threw out
Right.
Dave
Yeah.
Dinkins. That
And people
Pataki
threw out-
would
yes,
win. People
and
threw out
people threw out
Cuomo.
Mario.
But
So I mean, I think there was more of a negative.
But
vote.
why? Because
And
things
part of
were
it is
at the
myth
worst
creation
possible
and the
time.
and the great skills of political consultants to
Well.
position to redesign reality and
You know,
sell
But
it
they
to the
don't know, because
populace.
people vote mostly. They feel like, are my streets
Emotionally.
safe? How's my pocketbook doing? Do I need to leave town? What makes me kind of stay in New York? How's my community? How do the streets look? Do I feel like I said, do I feel safe? Is there a school I could send my
But
child
they
to?
also vote on
And
whether or not
things-
they feel connected to a candidate,
Right.
right? And so it's true in terms of myth building that they built this myth around the White Knight of Wall Street, who was on the cover of every magazine in the nation practically. The guy was all over the place, and he was crusading for the little people's pensions. And now, of course, there are different things that come out about his temperament and that he's really kind of an angry steamroller type
Right,
person. But they did create this situation, and he came right in and he said, He said right away, the legislature is garbage. These people are all a bunch of hacks. I'm going to change all of them, every single one. I'm going to change the situation. He had no friends in the legislature, right? So when he fell, there were very few Democrats who were running to pick him up. And that's a problem. Also, people said this guy who created this image, this myth of being a white knight, is just as dirty as the rest of them. I think that's the problem here. That's how far he's fallen in terms of image.
Two images. One is an issue of being strong. The other is an image of being honest. And those were the key to the election.
Right, yeah, I agree.
And now he's finding both of those eroding very seriously. If if Joe Bruno can be stronger,
who's under investigation by the FBI.
Right.
By the way.
And if Joe,
Sorry, but you know.
Well, those are the two things. I mean, you know, this is the point. If
swing the pendulum
an old man under investigation by the FBI can diminish Spitzer's honesty and strength, then just think of what a good Republican candidate can do in 2.5 years with good fundraising.
Well, it's also there's one other thing that kind of comes into play in all of that, and you touched on it in your introduction, was the press and how they're involved in this story. Now, there's another aspect.
It's part of the mud fest.
No. You said, but there was also one other thing that happened with Elliot Spitzer, and as Liz mentioned earlier, I did work on John Fasso's campaign. And one of excellent guy. But what happened there was Elliot Spitzer was going to win. No one questioned this. I mean, he really, really steamrolled then. He was more of a steamroller back before he was elected than when he became elected. But he never got scrutinized.
Should have had to sweat more.
He never got, they never sweated him out. They never looked at things, so they never saw who this guy was. They liked the idea, and I, speak to the press, as a group, they liked the stories, the white knight stories. They liked pumping it up. They went with it.
They were also tired of gridlock.
And, well, okay, so you had all of those stories.
At the time,
but now, when he comes under the slightest bit of fire, the press is piling on because they've never had because they never had the stories before. Let's face it, how many negative stories about Elliot Spitzer were there before?
And there are people
governor?
Who've been raising this. I mean, I can think of, let's see.
Besides me.
Predating you, Dennis Vacco, Ali Capel. I mean, these are people who ran against him and brought up issues about loans that circumvented the election law, multi-million-dollar loans that circumvented the election law that Bernard Spitzer, the father of Elliot Spitzer, who's a real estate mogul, made to him, and essentially that they covered up, lied, paid back, didn't pay back. I mean, the details are just completely murky. And people who now feel like, 8 years later, in some ways vindicated, in other ways enormously frustrated. We've been railing against this guy, John Whitehead, writes an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal. I mean, all this stuff is just... And now all of a sudden people look at him because the mantle has fallen to a certain degree that they're willing to take shots. Before, I think they were afraid. 70% is quite a mandate.
Absolutely.
You made one point that he didn't come in with any friends in Albany. And that he didn't go and get Shelly Silver, unlike Pataki, who did get Ralph Marino. One of Pataki's first actions was to kick out the Republican leader of the state Senate and put Joe Bruno in.
He can't make hard decisions.
But he does have a friend, and his name is Malcolm Smith. And he is the state senator from Queens who is the state Senate minority leader and is poised to be the majority leader.
If he can hold on to the minority leader's position.
But if, in fact, the Democrats can take that chamber,
if he can take
and you can see that the Senate minority, which is as invisible as you can get within the
assembly minorities,
as the assembly minority, because it's such a majority-controlled chamber, that they are much more loyal to the governor than the people in the assembly. So I think it's part of this strategy of, in fact, taking back that chamber. And I think that personally, I believe your comment about one-party rule is very well taken.
That's something to look for in the hearings, if there are Senate hearings. People like Eric Schneiderman on that committee are pit bulls.
Yeah.
And they are going to use their positions to raise issues ferociously and in ways that can advance an agenda that Bruno would rather not have spoken about.
True.
Well, I mean, the Senate Minority Leader did just hold a press conference, I think, in the
And he
last
offered-
saying
let's
move on.
put this behind us. Let's
Or else
everybody
get out
get
of
back
the way
to the
and let's
business.
If you can't
And
put
let's
it
take care
behind
of this
you,
agenda.
I'll take
Which
your
is
job.
kind of funny
take
since,
Right, I've
right,
been wanting
right.
to
Which is
So-
kind of, you know,
So he's
just
not
as
that
it's-
invisible.
Well, but he
Well.
says it in the light of there's still an investigation that, like I said, is by a commission that's majority appointed by the governor. So you don't listen to that. Should the ethics commission, based on that press conference, he's saying, let's not even do the ethics commission. Let's just put that away now. We've heard from the source, so we don't need to do
From the Albany
anything else.
DA, right.
And that's absurd. You wouldn't let the commission finish out its work? How can you even suggest such a thing?
There
Let me-
is
go ahead.
there is one other important
If there
difference
are.
between the Senate minority and the Assembly minority, and that is that the Senate minority is New York City based, has much better access to the media, is much more media savvy, and has an easier time getting their word out than the Assembly minority.
I
does.
happen to have,
And
having
it's
been
allied to a
having been a
Democratic
reporter,
incumbent governor.
but having been a reporter for
Serious
21 years,
institutional power.
it's kind of what you used to say about Latin America and about Central America in the 1980s, is that Americans will do anything for Central America except read about it. It's the same thing. Albany is 150 miles away and totally controls our lives. They could vote us out of existence if they wanted, and yet we never pay it. We never pay the proper attention to the power that Albany has, and I don't think the media will ever cover Albany to the degree degree it should, because frankly, City Hall is such a good psychodrama every day. Let me start taking some questions. Tell us the campus you're from and ask your question, please.
Yes, hi, good evening. I'm from York College, and my name is Leonora Girardi. And I would like to pose my question to Ms. Benjamin, if I could.
Sure.
Okay. With respect to ethics and trust in the news, and for all the students and citizens, my concern and my question is, why is it that the news is not newsworthy and not giving the information that is of substance to its readers to have a better understanding for all the political runners, leaders, laws, bills, on primary day or on the weekend prior to primary day? I looked in the Daily News to see some information.
Yeah, I know what you're saying.
And unfortunately,
Yeah. Okay. I could go into a long treatise on what's wrong with newspapers and the media in general today, and I'm going to try not to. Part of the problem is, I think Bob has just been talking about in terms of, and I know you're talking about primary in Brooklyn, or largely, but there were primaries elsewhere in the city. It has to do with revenues and advertising and appetite and what drives the news. And in some people believe, particularly in news coverage, that politics isn't sexy enough, particularly when it comes to substantive politics, and there's just no room for it when Britney Spears has another meltdown. I mean, and I'm not speaking specifically to the Daily News. I'm speaking about news in general.
But don't you also think that even when you start to even try and get into the political world, the only thing that really starts to matter are the headlines when you see a food fight among, X and Y.
That helps juice things
I mean,
up.
that's typically what we also end up seeing in politics.
But particularly from a tabloid perspective.
Right, and I also think that the New York City media market, because actually that's mostly what I focus on, is something that's so competitive. It's not just your average media market like anywhere else in the country. It's the world's media market. So the tabloids, for example, the Post and the News will drive about 60% of the cable show's coverage on certain things, whether it be Britney Spears or whether it be a presidential race. So you have Fox and CNN and MSNBC running their news off of that. So it's a very competitive environment to talk about a city council race.
Let me speak up for the press. First of all, a lot of the issues that people say we're not covering, people know about. Now, this is I was a reporter for 21 years. I'm not anymore. That they are, so I have to go shift from we to them. Yes. A lot of issues that people complain the media are not covering, people know about because the media have or has covered it, depending on whether it's a plural or a singular
in-depth
noun.
issues,
that's right.
not really.
But you know, you can lead a horse to water, you can't make it drink. People have got to make their own efforts. I mean, I think this is a bigger problem if you go around the country. You look at Miami as a one-paper town, Dallas is a one-paper town, San Francisco is virtually a one-paper town. You know, we have 4 papers. So, you know, 4 papers, or 5 if you count Newsday. If you start throwing in Spanish language papers, you throw in another 2, you have a whole bunch of Chinese language papers, there are Russian language papers. I mean, you have a multiplicity. We have how many TV news stations, how many radio news stations?
Plus all the blogs now. We have all this online stuff.
If you make the effort to find this information, there's a huge amount of information out there. But, you know, it's not going to be on the front page. You just have to go back into the paper. So I actually think that's a little bit of a bum rap. I do think that, you know, for instance, at the news, when I was at the news, a lot of the political coverage got stuck in the borough sections, a lot of the city, but people found it. People who were into it. You know, I had an editor at Newsday when I worked at Newsday who said, I hate hockey, but we have like, you know, so many thousands of people who were into hockey, so we have a hockey reporter. So, I mean, you know, TV is a different issue because TV is broadcasting. Newspapers are narrowcasting. I don't know why I'm explaining the news media business, but, you know, newspapers are narrowcasting, and it is a little something for everybody in that paper. So I think there's a little bit of a, I've always thought that's a little bit of a bum rap. Pardon me, I'm doing a better defense of the business than you are.
I'm not going to defend the business. The business is a difficult and
but I do think the role of the media.
Situation.
Let me just take 1 second before I go back to a question that the role of the media in this one is one of the magnificent aspects that makes it entertaining. A reporter was subpoenaed because the suggestion is that the reporter was told to ask for this information.
Which happens all the time.
Which happens all the time. And I happen to think that it's probably reporters who weren't asked to ask for this information who might be upset about this whole thing going on, but they went to the Albany Times-Union. And I mean, a lot of people would call me up and give me a tip and say, you ought to ask for this information. Why this is somehow scandalous, but it does. But this reporter was subpoenaed. They wisely
well, I mean,
in
all fairness,
back.
They were saying the problem is they put together this information in order to be foiled. Not hey, take a look at this agency. Why don't you look at their budget? It's something. That's a tip. There's something to look into. When you say, before you give the reporter the tip, you say, let me put all my files together. Let's ask some people to put together some special reports.
On his travel, right.
And then ask a reporter to foil and ask for freedom of information. That's a completely different ballpark, and that's what we were talking about.
That is the self-inflicted wound, right there.
And that's what we're talking about with Spitzer.
Yes, ma'am. Speak up, please.
Good evening. My name is Francesca Tessier. I attend John Jay College of Criminal Justice. I was very intrigued to see the plunder that's going on in Albany. I was wondering, this is open for the panel, where do you think the governor stands now, and what do you think is his next move as far as his political agenda?
Well, at one point, and like we were saying earlier, it was about this guy was riding so high that people were like, oh, and in 8 years he's going to run for president. I mean, and he's made people around him have made no secret of his desire to do that. At this point, there are some people around him who say
he said no, and Tom Suozzi said yes. I want to be president.
Yeah, that's ridiculous. but you know, any poll above a certain above a certain level, who says he or she is not interested, is just completely lying. If somebody came to some elected official and said, tomorrow you can be president, they're going to say no. Like, I can't even imagine. I don't know anybody who would do that, or most of them. But I think now there are some people around him who say he might not run, he might not make it through a second term. You know, if maybe he gets challenged potentially by Andrew Cuomo, potentially by someone else, potentially by a strong Republican candidate, whatever might happen. So that's a pretty far way to fall. What he does next for political agenda, I think, based solely on the demographics of this state, most people expect that if not in 2008, then in 2010, the Senate Democrats are going to take over the Senate. I mean, that's just part of the makeup, unless they redraw the lines. And the next chance they have to do that is in 2010, and then they'll fight about it, and it'll be protracted, and it won't, you know, the census is in 2010, so it won't apply then. I think he just tries to hold on politically. And in terms, if you're talking about policy, that's a different story. I mean, the guy's got to put together a budget. He's got to give another state of the state. He's got to preside over a session during which they may or may not get something done. But politically, this does not end until November 2008, for good.
But to what degree is Bruno throwing up as many smokescreens as he can to stop stuff from happening he doesn't want to see?
Well, I would answer that this way. I think what the governor has to do now is produce on a substantive policy
But he
agenda.
can't produce
Because
without the other guys.
Well, but you're begging the question. That's the whole point. He's got to get back to the table and exercise some good government, and that's the only thing that's going to propel any of these elected officials forward, is to be able to show the people that they've addressed all of this myriad of key issues, this backlog that's in Albany right now. Gubernatorial appointments being held up. He'll be held responsible too. If he doesn't put his people in place to run these agencies, to sit on the SUNY trustee board, to get the MTA chairman in place. So he's going to have to sit down and do business with the other two leaders in Albany. And he's going to have to show that he's got a track record on public policy, and good government will be good politics. That'll extend every politician's life.
Let me take a very different point.
But if one guy won't sit down, if it takes 3 guys to tango in this instance, and one guy won't come to the party, then how do you get anything done?
I could see Senator Bruno not wanting to come to the party, but this whole question of who's going to be in charge of the Senate, we'll have the answer in November of.
Yeah, but he still has a lot to go until then.
Remember the government shutdown and the standoff between Bill Clinton and Newt Gingrich.
Yeah, and then Newt Gingrich was subsequently out of a job, not so
long. People blame the legislature when this happens.
But not their legislature, not their legislator, not the person who's local.
The institution.
And if you get things passed by the Assembly with the support of the governor, and everybody's standing around waiting for the Senate to act, and everybody's pointing a finger at Joe Bruno, you reach the point where where Bruno has either no choice or there is an
I respectfully disagree with that.
I know.
So only because ask Shelly Silver how he was ousted because of that strategy. You hold the governor of the state responsible. You hold the mayor. You don't hold the city council, and you don't hold the legislature. People will always hate the legislature. They'll hate the majority leader. They'll hate the assembly. They'll hate Congress. They hate their council. But as a whole, they'll like their own elected officials.
Yeah,
because
he shows up at the funeral and the
picnic. With the governor,
if the
governor,
he wasn't.
And that happened internally on the Democratic side.
Right, and he did that by virtue of exercising patronage powers beyond belief.
But what I'm saying is that Pataki did not get a lot of his agenda through that people would have deemed popular at some levels, especially on taxes. And Shelly Silver didn't pay a price for it while he was
because he has a Democratic constituency and not a Republican.
But I also believe the reason he didn't
Democratic
pay a price
majority in the state.
Because the corollary of what you're saying is people blame the legislature, but from a public relations point of view, from a press point of view, the governor, the executive, the mayor, the governor, the president, that's the focus. And while people may say a plague on both their houses, it's the executive that takes the PR hit, I believe, more than the
institution. On the ground, they're all playing retail politics.
They all get reelected. We talk about free elections every 2 years.
Yeah, only a 1% non-turnover every year.
Right, but it's a free election. They're people who run against each other. They have elections. People show up to the polls.
There are structural
yes, but you have to say it's technically an open. We're not, they're not being anointed.
Term limits every 2 years.
Right, so you have these people being elected. They will just take the heat as being a bad guy as a group, not necessarily. I think the governor will be the one who really has to explain why people's taxes aren't lower and why their kids aren't going to better schools.
If that happens next year, I'll bet you the price of this table that there's at least a 3-seat turnover in the Senate.
Well, I mean, this is Harry Truman. This is Harry Truman running against the do-nothing Congress. I mean, that is an argument to make. But I just think that when everybody gets dragged down into the muck, it's the executive that suffers more on a personal level politically than it is a legislative body. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, my name is Stephanie Jean. I'm from Brooklyn College, political science major.
I was a political science major at Brooklyn College.
Here.
Just a quick question. I know we're talking about the state, but I wanted to sort of bring up the presidency. I don't quite understand, aside from the Republican majority. Well, that was a while ago, but I don't understand why there isn't much of an outcry against, for an impeachment of the president, compared to, like, let's say when Clinton was president, and just something personal.
I think one. Let me try that. I mean, I think one major reason is that an impeachment of the president, whether I think that the president sent us to war through just kind of sheer lies and might, on a technical basis, qualify for impeachment, it would sow gridlock. I mean, if you think Albany is gridlock, remember what kind of gridlock we had in Washington during the Clinton impeachment. It would be so destructive of getting anything done that there's a degree of fatigue, I believe, over the whole question of impeachment. And it's just... plus, I don't think the votes are there.
Right. You would need a critical mass in both houses to actually pull that off. And the Democrats in both houses have very thin majorities, and there's a huge number of marginals within their majority.
Yep.
Those are districts that had Republicans in them 6 months ago. So that's an issue that even so-called a lot of recently elected Democrats are probably not willing to go out on a point on right now.
Plus, if you remember, and you should correct me, but I think I'm right, Clinton was impeached, but nothing happened. I mean, in the time that we went through the gridlock and the partisanship and the fighting and the back and forth, and things were in the Lewinsky fracas, at the end, nothing happened. At the end, he was still there. And so what's the point,
Clinton became more popular.
He's Bush is going to get out of office regardless.
I'm not saying, I'm not saying he didn't become more popular. I don't think the only reason he became more popular is because he underwent an impeachment process. I think there was actually, a lot of people will say his policies. Don't forget, this was a long time ago. The Democrats, Republicans liked him. He was the Democrat Republicans could work with. He put forth an agenda that was fairly conservative viewed today as for a Democrat. But in addition to that, Congress was elected in the 2006 election saying, we will change everything. We will get us out of the war. We will fix everything that's wrong.
It sounds like day one everything changes kind of.
But on the national level, if they do it and they can't impeach, and they can't even get there. They can't get out of the war. They are running a huge
they will not be able.
I'm going to go to I actually think that Clinton's success started when the Republicans took control of Congress, because he was unable to get a lot done in his first couple of years, but in opposition to kind of the loony right that took over the Contract with America crowd, that by contrast with them and by political skills, he preempted them and he stopped a lot of bad things from happening. And maybe that's a lesson for what goes on in Albany about one party rule.
That's exactly what
So wait, Spitzer should come into the Senate and take their issues?
Shelly Silver during the 12 years of Pataki, people complained he blocked things from happening. I was happy with a lot of the things that Shelly blocked from happening. And maybe somebody who, I'm a Democrat, but if you were a Republican, you might make the same argument about Bruno that when you talked about one-party rule,
he's
stopping
barely
people
a Republican.
From, well, he is. I happen to agree with that. I happen to agree with that.
But you said earlier there were smoke screens that Bruno puts up, and he's, I would take issue with that word, because his smoke screens are taxes. Right. There are issue-oriented. These are the substantive issues. Now, you may disagree with his agenda, but the thing is that what the Senate is doing is saying what you call smoke screen is saying this is our agenda, and they are allowed to voice their legislative agenda.
We will politically block you until you're ready to sit down.
They're willing to give up a lot if you're willing to. You got it.
Yeah,
that's what they're doing.
What will they accept in those negotiations?
It's the power game.
Except I do think that, and I saw it with the death penalty. You see it now, where Bruno, I think, is
You saw
Also
it with
a
the
very
death
good-
penalty in
a
a
very
very
good-
extreme case
a
that
very good-
was an emotional case for a
But
lot
he
of
had
New
voted
Yorkers.
for it, and then he came
the
back and he
Brinker
voted for it
Hockey,
again,
like
and he was going to
Troopers
come back
shot
and voted for it again. Nobody, there was actually research done. They couldn't quite figure out if the legislature, if the same chamber had voted several times in the same session on the same
But
bill.
how about education aid?
Well, I mean,
Perfect.
That's a
Fine.
substantive, brass knuckles negotiation.
You got it.
And they
Of
make
funding
sure they come
formulas.
away from the table with what they want
No.
for their communities and their districts every time.
And Republicans actually won out very well on that on the
Well,
local level.
because Spitzer folded.
Right,
Wow.
exactly.
Spitzer
Okay.
said, "I'm going to break the
Regardless,
back
now,
of.
because
I'm going to break
He
the back
brought
of
some
shares."
of that, a huge
Okay.
chunk of CFE money back
Yeah, he
to
did.
New
But
York
he then
City.
said, "I'm going to break the
But-
back of shares, which keeps everybody,
Okay,
which
but
used to keep
he-
everybody the same." And then he came back
Well,
to
he
the.
didn't go
But
all
they
the way.
delivered.
No, he gave
You
them
can't
high
deny
tax
they
rate.
It's called
delivered.
negotiation.
let me take.
That's what it
we're
is.
starting to run out of time. Let me
Compromise
take another
and
questions. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, my name is Iolanta Biderman, and I'm a student at political science, also in Brooklyn College. And my question, practically to all of you, and well, you mentioned the popular vote, and my question is, how do you consider the population, I call it marginalized populations, such as legal residents, here may impact the making of the policies? Because I know that many students even don't know what kind of the rights in terms of the voting they have here in America. They know that they are not allowed to vote on the federal level, but how about the local level?
You're talking
And
about
I
immigrants, right?
yes,
Yeah,
and
well,
I think nobody ever, when we see all those flyers around in campaign, right? Nobody even mentions or somehow
Actually,
I
people are
sort of
mentioning
alludes.
Well,
immigrants.
just today
People are
they're
mentioning
mentioning it, which
immigrants
is
quite a
why
lot.
this
And
is
there
a
was
great
a
question.
time. There was a time in New York when legal residents did vote in local
And
elections.
school board
that's
elections.
right.
And
Well,
municipal
other
elections
elections.
Other elections.
If you go
Yeah.
back far enough, right.
This
So-
is an interesting thing because this is one of the ways that the governor is trying to turn the conversation.
Is this with the drivers?
Yeah, with the
Driver's
driver's
license.
licenses, and then also today. It's a very controversial thing that
Yes.
he did, which sort of took a chunk out of some of the Troopergate coverage, which is
what?
that he changed the policy. He directed the DMV. It's an executive thing. He doesn't. The legislature can't. To
yet.
in order to right, they're going to.
He actually rescinded it, Governor Pataki.
Right.
Right,
In order
exactly.
to
That's
get
what
a
he did.
driver's license, you no longer have to provide a social security number or other forms of
Verifiable.
verifiable
Right.
federal ID.
Federal ID.
And so,
Right.
therefore, if you're an
federal.
illegal, you can come and get a driver's license. And once you're here, it doesn't help you getting into the country, of course,
Right,
because.
right.
But once you're here, that is, everybody knows, the bona fide identification that almost everyone, the preeminent identification.
You can use a passport.
And
for
then
example.
today, he subsequently held a press conference at Bellevue Hospital where he slammed the federal government for, and I wasn't there, so I'm working off the press release here, but for failing to provide funding for chemotherapy treatment to illegals. So now what you're talking about is, particularly in New York City, this was a great issue. Any of these immigrant issues, even though people who are immigrants, most of them, some of them, depending on who they are, can't vote. Of course, if you're Puerto Rican, you can. Depends on if you're naturalized,
You're
whatever.
Puerto Rican, you're not an immigrant.
You're not an
Right,
immigrant,
right.
you're a
You're,
migrant.
that's right.
You're a
From
U.S.
the
citizen.
Commonwealth, right?
Yes.
Isn't I right?
Right.
So
You don't need a passport to
you
go
don't.
back.
Right. You do need a driver's license. You
Well,
probably
you
need
may now.
identification.
No,
You want to drive, you need a driver's
But
license.
the issue, I think, is it's plays very high in New York. And you see Mayor Bloomberg, when he was a Republican, before he disaffiliated, talking about hitting back to Mitt Romney, who hit Mayor Giuliani for saying that New York City is a sanctuary for illegals. Mayor Bloomberg stepping up and saying, yeah, keep them coming. This is great. It's fantastic. They're the backbone of our city. So these are the kind of bread and butter issues that play very well
But
for
there's a huge
governor.
difference between illegal immigrants seeking a driver's license and and then the debate over legal immigrants wanting the right to vote. I mean, to me, you
Yes.
could not
Right.
say
That's
that
What's
they
the
don't.
Yes.
answer to the question?
There's
I
two
say
separate-
yes. At least in municipal elections. Why? Because there are 8 million people in New
You're
York
saying
City,
let people
and
vote.
half of those 8 million are immigrants and their children. So the turnout in this primary, the reason you didn't see it in the media, because there were almost no elections to cover. And the one big election in the entire city was for surrogate judge in Brooklyn, where
mm-hmm.
you had a 5% turnout. That seat was
A very
won
powerful
with
patronage,
45,000
John.
voters, and there
Let
were a
me
million
get-
It's amazing how
registered
such a
voters.
machine couldn't turn out 3%
We got
of the vote.
three. It's much more complicated than
didn't-
that. It's. I'm sorry.
To continue on the theme of the low voter turnout, I was wondering what each of you think your role as an educator, a consultant, or a media person has for the decline in voter turnout and the apathy of and if any of you are willing to step up and change the education system so that starting in elementary school there's better civics and understanding of issues. Because
Well,
even
just
at the
give us-
college
Totally
level,
agree.
Give us your
There-
name and
Count on me.
campus, by the way.
Count me in.
Brooklyn College.
Medgar Evers College. Count us in on that one.
Well, but, I mean, there's a reality that needs to be faced, and I'll say like the big ugly truth that no one wants is probably, well, none of these folks do, so I can actually, I'll be the only one who admits to it.
Let's hear it.
When you
I'm a dog
when
who
you
lies.
have a candidate, Republican or Democrat, you look at a district, no matter what it is, and you say, where are my votes coming from? How do I get the most votes, and how do I get those people to the polls?
Who have a history of voting.
Who have a history of voting. Well, however it is. Or you decide, I can't, maybe you're the insurgent candidate. You can't go after prime voters. You go after the people who only vote once in a while.
Right.
And maybe whatever your tactic is, you go after those voters and you get them to the polls however you can. And if you are perfectly happy if everyone else stays home. So
As long
that's
as you
not
don't
what the job-
discourage the other people from
Well,
voting.
no,
Right.
absolutely.
But you don't
So-
encourage
no, no,
them either.
but
That's
you
one
don't
thing.
encourage.
Not
I'm
encouraging
talking
them is
about,
okay.
she has what
Discouraging them is not.
Right, and she talked about our role. You're like as a journalist, you have a different role to educate and bring out. Everyone has different roles. As a consultant, all you want to do is get your people to the polls.
But there's a larger view here. You're absolutely right. That's the job of a political consultant. You get paid for your candidate to win. That's your job. But the larger job of democracy is participation of the citizenry and the residents. And the issue we're not addressing is there has been a major decline in voter participation in New York City elections. There were 500,000 less people that voted for Bloomberg Green in 2005 than voted in the Dinkins-Giuliani election in 1993. 1.9 million versus 1.4 million. More than 500,000 registered voters, not people who weren't eligible, stayed home. So that's an issue we need to deal with.
But that's not quite that easy. I mean, first of all, people have moved out of the city and people have moved into the
These are
city.
people that are on the rolls I'm talking about.
Let me
you do a total number of people
on the
who vote.
rolls, but
Seize
they come
control
to
of
the
my
polls.
show.
But
Let me
secondly,
seize
there are an
control of my-
awful
We're
lot of
about to
people
say
who'd rather
goodbye.
go out
Good luck,
dancing.
Bob.
I'm about to get the goodbye
Good night.
sign. I want to thank everybody. I think this was a very spirited conversation. And we will see you all next time on the CUNY Forum. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.